Hey guys, how are you? Today I'm going to be showing you a very important part of my painting process with gouache, which is my mixing palette. I talk a lot about how when I'm painting, a good chunk of my time is spent mixing my paints rather than painting with them. So today I'm going to show you guys how exactly I do that. Just because with gouache, I feel like it's a much more complicated process than mixing paints with watercolors. I am using my miya gouache. The colors I'm using are titanium white, earth yellow, deep red, ultramarine, and lemon yellow. So while I am showing you guys the colors that I'm actually using, today I'm going to talk more about the process of me mixing the paints. So if you guys want to know more about how to mix skin tones, I actually have a different video for that. It's with watercolors, but the process is very similar. So if you guys want to see that, the link will be in the description. I've prepped my gouache so that the consistency is very close to how it was when it was new, just so you guys can get a better understanding of the consistency that I'm working with. I like to start off with the lighter colors first, and that's because it's easier to lighten your darker colors that you mix later on with these lighter ones that you're mixing right now. If I had went with my darker colors first, I would risk muddying up my lighter colors, which is something that I don't want. So I test out my mixes on the same sheet of paper before starting the actual painting. And by the way, you guys, I'm using non-watercolor paper for this because I'm not planning on using many loose washes this time. I'm most likely going to be layering more opaque colors on top of each other without really using that much water. So mixing midtones is actually harder to do with, I feel like, with miya gouache, because it would either turn out looking gray or not light enough. So that is why I really need to save those darker colors for later on. And I kind of have a theory for this because this white might have the tiniest bit of blue to it. So if you're looking at the whites, it doesn't really look like there's much of a difference between them. But because I'm using the titanium white, I do feel like that's why my colors look a little dull when I start mixing with it. But again, I'm really not sure because just visually I can't see that much of a difference between those two whites. But that would be a good explanation. So it's very important that you're really mixing your brush in there because sometimes paint gets stuck in the bristles and you might end up with different colors when you start painting with it. So as soon as I start mixing my darker colors with the skin tones, I always go with the red and blue first because they make this really nice purple, and I feel like that's a good baseline to make the shadows on the face. And then I just start adding in the yellows when I want to bring that bright purple down. So I'm using the same light mix that I did before so I can lighten up those shadows. So this is why I always go with the lighter colors first. It makes the darker ones easier to lighten up, and when you're mixing the same colors together, it keeps the color palette looking cohesive. So that's also another bonus. So here, because I went with a darker color and now I want to go lighter than that, the colors start looking really muddy. And when I did finally get the values that I want, it looks like it's a duller version of it, and so the colors aren't looking so vibrant. So that's why I really recommend using 2 jars of water with gouache. One to wash off the previous colors and another one to really make sure the brush is clean. This advice is given more for watercolors, but I do feel like it's also very, very important with gouache. Just because with gouache the paint clings onto your brushes more, they're more likely to get stuck in your bristles. And so if you use 2 jars of water, the colors will be as true to themselves as they can be. For this reason, I really like using synthetic brushes with shorter bristles when I'm painting with gouache, just because when you accidentally add too much water into your gouache mixes, it really messes up with the opacity. And for me at least, I try to work with a very opaque paints, and if I do go for transparent washes, I prefer using my watercolors. So it's either that, or make sure you top your brushes off with a paper towel and remove the excess water when you're painting with it. I really struggled to get the blush on her cheek right, and at first it was too dull and then it was too red, and I had to redo that area a couple of times more until I decided to just leave it a color that's not really as vibrant as a red as I wanted, but I just blended it out with nothing on my brush except for a little bit of water that I brushed off the excess with before I used that clean brush to blend out the edges. When colors look too bright or out of place, like her hair initially did, what I do is just swirl my brush over my old mixes, which are about the same value. That way, the other colors dull it down a little bit without making it look darker or lighter. So something new that I discovered very recently is to wash out my palette about halfway through. But if you have maybe a bigger mixing palette than I have, you won't need to do this. But as soon as it became too hard to me to even find a clean surface to mix new paints on, that already tells me that I need to start fresh. This way the colors look fresher and they're not gonna dull each other down anymore. Just because when I'm mixing with gouache, I use a very big surface just to mix in the colors that I want, especially with lighter colors, because you're using white to make it look lighter instead of just water like with watercolors. So those little adjustments that are very hard to do when you're mixing skin tones, by the way, they're gonna add up and take up a lot of real estate in your mixing palette. Not to mention your brush, like I said before, your brushes hold a lot of paint in them, so when you're mixing the colors, you really need to make sure you're working it in and no unmixed paint is hiding in the bristles, because those will show up as streaks on your paper and you really don't want that. So when I'm mixing transition colors, what I like to do is to add white to the last color that I mixed if I want it to look a little bit lighter. So this really helps with how hard it is to blend with gouache. Instead of focusing on actually blending, I just add as many transition colors as I can. So this here is what happens when I forget to remove the extra water from my brush. The paint becomes too watery and streaky, and it's very hard to replicate that exact same colors since it's a weird mix of every other colors that I have in my palette. So yeah, even though I did finish the little background that I did for her, I already knew that I was going to have to go over it again later on when it's dry. So here I want you guys to see how hard it is to reactivate gouache that's dried up in clumps in your palette. Well, it isn't actually that hard to just reactivate it, but it is very hard to get it to be the consistency that it originally was. So it's easy to get paint out of dried gouache, but it's hard to get it to be as opaque as it was when it was fresh. So I really tried to put some water in this first one, and I tried to work that in, but actually ended up fraying my brush for this one because of this, and still it wasn't as opaque as I needed it to be for the details. So now I'm just going over the darker details, and it's easier for me to mix them, but had I not washed my palette before, it would have been really hard to mix these darker colors without the white contaminating them. And so I can go over and mix my lighter colors in its own little nook, because I won't need a lot of lighter colors for this stage. So yeah, everything has its own corner, and for this one, where I need them to be as pure as possible, it was really important that I washed my palette beforehand. Okay, so I was gonna end the video right here, but as I was filming this, my Holbein gouache got here and I couldn't help it. I started going over it with my Holbein gouache, and I just enjoyed it so much that I kept on painting with it. The colors just stayed true to themselves for longer, and I didn't really get the problem I had where the colors get muddy easily. Maybe it has something to do with the white that I'm using. Maybe this one is a purer white, but I'll test that out later on, and I'll do a more comprehensive comparison between these two later on as well. So yeah, I got to fix the problems that I had with her face. I really felt like her skin tone was looking too cool, and because it was easy to mix lighter skin tones with warm undertones with the Holbein gouache, I was able to get it to be what I wanted it to look like. I even think that even the darker mixes I did look more saturated, and I was able to achieve that warm brown that I wanted for the shadows under her chin, which is very hard for me to get with a miya gouache. I always ended up with a more neutral looking brown. So I went over it with more of the details. I did the finishing with the Holbeins, and I really enjoyed this stage. I hope this video helped you guys. I wasn't able to find a lot of gouache videos that had the mixing palettes in the frame, and that's why I think it was very hard for me when I was starting out with painting with gouache, just because this is a big part of the process and you don't always get to see it. And it's something that most people overlook when they're starting out. So yeah, I hope this one helped you guys in any way, and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. So I will see you again soon.